Hello, greetings from Basel in Switzerland to all of you who hear and see these sermons. We're in a series on the book of Acts by Luke, and we've come to the last chapter, chapter 28. At the end of chapter 27, everyone had arrived safely on shore from a shipwreck in which the ship that Paul and Luke were traveling on was destroyed. And so we continue from there. Once safely ashore, we found out that the island was called Malta, or Melita, that the ancient people called it. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. Now, the Greek word for islander is not islander, it's barbarian. And the Greeks had two categories of people. They had people who understood and spoke Greek, and people who spoke another language. And anyone who spoke another language was called a barbarian. And it came from a Greek word barbar, which meant babble. So there were Greek-speaking people, and then there were babblers from everywhere else in the world. So it means foreigner or local people, native, something like that. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Now, a lot of ships crashed on Malta or wintered in Malta, and the local people were very used to foreigners being there, especially over the winter. And they may often have paid no attention to them, but they were very kind to these people. They built a fire and welcomed us. Now, there were 276 people, so it must have been a very large fire or a very long fire. Luke doesn't say exactly how they organized. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood. The Greek says sticks, but brushwood is probably more accurate because there are almost no trees on Malta now, and there may not have been very many then, and so they would have made a fire out of bushes and hedges. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, the Greek word is snake, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. Now, a viper is a venomous snake. And there are no venomous snakes in Malta today, as there are no venomous snakes in Ireland today, although there used to be. And so there used to be venomous snakes in Malta because the local people thought this snake was a venomous snake. It says it fastened itself on his hand. It bit him on the hand. Then verse 4, when the islanders saw the snake, the Greek word is beast, not snake, hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea," it says, having been saved from the sea, "the goddess Justice," it just says justice, "has not allowed him to live." So the Maltese had a sense of justice, a sense of, as we might say, karma, that there was a justice and a logic and a tit for tat in the universe, and that this man has been almost miraculously saved from the storm on the sea, and now a snake bit him, and so he must be a murderer or something else. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. Now, the order of things is a bit out of order here because I can't imagine that Paul stood there with this snake hanging from his hand while the local people had this conversation about his guilt and being saved. Normally, if a snake bites your hand jumping out of a fire, you shake it off in a moment, just instantly, you shake it off back into the fire. So the people would have had a very brief glimpse of the snake, and they would have assumed that it was venomous. And it certainly may have been, but there were non-venomous snakes, grass snakes, there at the same time, and it could possibly have been non-venomous. And Luke's point is they thought it was venomous, and maybe it was. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. This may be Luke's main point in telling this account, is the fickle nature of people. That previously people had thought Paul and Apollos were gods, and then later on they stoned them nearly to death. Here it's the opposite direction. They thought he was a murderer, and now he's going to die because of his previous sins and crimes. And then when he didn't die, they changed their mind completely and thought he was a god. So people are very fickle and likely to change their minds rapidly about someone. Then verse 7. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief man of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. Now, we don't know who exactly Luke means by us, certainly Paul and himself, but it would have had to be a very big house indeed to welcome 276 people. So it could have been a small group, and then the others lived in tents or in the local population. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery, which in those days would ordinarily have been fatal. I've had amoebic dysentery that I got in North Africa, and I thought I might die from it. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. Now we might compare Peter's healings, where he says, I did not heal you, Jesus Christ healed you. But Luke seems to be indicating that Paul placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. It doesn't say healed, it says cured, which would be a less miraculous kind of event. And very possibly, Paul was working, praying, helping people, but Luke was a doctor. And so he may very well have been working with Paul to cure these people and to help them medically, which would have been, of course, very much appreciated, the prayer and the practical medical help. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. The supplies they needed at that time, but also the supplies for their coming journey, because everybody knew they would be sailing away as soon as the springtime came and it was safe to sail. Verse 11. After 3 months we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship, which means probably it was part of the Roman grain fleet, so it was carrying grain from Egypt to Rome, with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux, who were thought to be sons of Zeus, and they were twins, and the Greek name is Dioscuri, and they were represented in the heavens by the constellation of Gemini, which is still an astrological sign today, and they were patrons of navigation. And sailors were very encouraged at the end of a storm to see the constellation Gemini. And so it was quite logical that this would be at the front of a ship and would be the symbol of the ship. So they sailed away from most likely Valletta, Malta. We put in at Siracusa and stayed there 3 days. Now, Siracusa was the largest city in Sicily at that time, and it's on the southeastern coast. And they stayed there 3 days to unload and load and repair and take care of things. From there, we set sail and arrived at Rhegium, that's Reggio Calabria, at the toe of the Italian boot, just across the Straits of Messina from Sicily. The next day the south wind came up, and on the following day we reached Puteoli. This is very fast sailing, so they're really making up for lost time in a way. Puteoli was the port of Naples at the time, and then in other centuries it changed to Naples, and it was, of course, very near Vesuvius, which had not erupted yet and didn't erupt until 79. We're probably talking about 60, 61. So it wasn't that long before Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii, which was very near, sort of in between Naples and Puteoli. There in Puteoli, which was a very large port, the main port for receiving grain for all of Italy, there we found some brothers and sisters, some Christians, who invited us to spend a week with them. We don't know how many people are going on this trip on land, so we don't know how many people were staying with the Christians there in Puteoli. Possibly not the whole 276. Many of them may have gone in different directions or had other things to do, but there were some group of them, particularly Paul and Luke. And so we went toward Rome, on foot, on land. The brothers and sisters there in Rome had heard that we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the Three Taverns to meet us. So they'd come south from Rome, because Paul and Luke were going north, excuse me, to meet them. And the word meet is very interesting in connection with the end of 1 Thessalonians, where Paul talks about going to meet the Lord in the air. It's the same word. And it's a word that was used for the citizens, the elders of a town, coming out of the town to meet the emperor, for instance, who was coming to visit, and to accompany him into the town. And here the people came south to meet Paul, to accompany him to Rome, where he was going. They weren't coming to go back to Malta with him. And so in 1 Thessalonians, when Jesus is coming, the people meet him in the air, not to go someplace else with him, but to come with him onto the earth where he is coming. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. So this would have been an honor and a privilege and a sign of trust, partly because Paul was a Roman citizen, and partly because the centurion and the other Roman soldiers who came with Paul would tell how he behaved on the ship and how he behaved on the land, and was welcomed by the leading Roman official in Malta. And so he would have a very good report and reputation, and he was allowed to live by himself rather than in the prison or the refugee colony or other places where he might have kept. So with Paul, we can remember that God is with us in all our journeys. Physical journeys, emotional, educational, professional, relational. God bless you and help you to remember him always. Amen.